Lagos, 1998. The sea chest arrived on a Harmattan morning. Its wood was darkened by age, its brass corners green with the patience of time. It was carried into the archives building by two sweating attendants who cursed softly as they wrestled with its immense weight. Dr. Adaeze Okonkwo watched from her office doorway, her breath catching in her throat, as though she already understood that her life was about to fracture into a before and an after. This one came from London. One attendant grunted, wiping his brow. "Be careful with it, madame. It has history. History. A dangerous word in Nigeria, too sharp to hold, without bleeding, a little." The chest was unmarked except for a faded engraving on the lid, H.M. Marlowe, and beneath it, the crest of the old Colonial office. Adaeze had seen that name before, scattered in the footnotes of old Colonial records. Sir Henry Marlowe, assistant resident in Zungaru, later a liaison to the Northern Protectorate Council, and finally an advisor to the London delegation during the heat of Nigeria's constitutional negotiations. He was a quiet figure in all the official accounts, always present in key moments, but never quoted directly, never photographed, never blamed. A shadow man. Adaeze signed for the chest, her signature small and neat against the large shipping label, and then gestured for the attendants to place it inside her office. When they finally left, she stood over it for a long, long time, her hands on her hips, just listening. She heard the distant horns from the Lagos Marina and the gentle rustle of palm fronds scraping against her windows. Dust motes spun lazily in the sunbeams that slanted across her floor. Settling on the chest like a thin, shimmering veil, Adaeze had been waiting for this. For 10 years, she had been meticulously assembling the puzzle of Nigeria's early political fractures. She was trying to understand how a country so full of promise had slipped so quickly into chaos. Every historian knew the broad strokes, the imbalance baked into the federation from the start. The long, dark shadows of the 1966 coups, the decades of military rule that followed. But there were always whispers beneath the official story. Rumors of foreign hands, of colonial strings being pulled long after the puppeteers had supposedly left the stage. And now, perhaps here in this chest, lay the missing pieces she had been searching for. She knelt beside the chest. Her fingers hovered over the clasp for a moment before she pressed down firmly. The old brass clicked open with a satisfying sound. The smell that rose from inside was the scent of another dust, aging paper, and something faintly medicinal, as though the box had stored secrets far too potent to be kept untreated. The letter trembled in Adi's hands. She told herself it wasn't fear, but the heavy weight of anticipation. She gently slid the single sheet of paper from its envelope. The handwriting was elegant, but it had softened with age, the ink feathered like the edges of burnt cloth. She began to read. To the historian who finally seeks the truth, if you have found this, then Nigeria has long outlived the illusions with which we crafted her. I owe explanation, though I suspect forgiveness is too much to ask. Begin with the diaries, but trust them only partly, for the truth of empire is like saltpeter stable until heat is applied. There are things I wrote for myself, and things I wrote for posterity, and things I dare not write at all, yet all of them shape the nation you inhabit. Read, and judge me if you must, but understand, we believed we were saving a fragile territory from itself. Whether we damned it instead, you must decide. Signed H.M. Marlowe. Adaeze lowered the paper, a chill creeping beneath her skin. It wasn't fear, but a sense of recognition. The tone felt so deliberate, almost manipulative. It was as if Marlowe had pictured this very moment, known that one day a Nigerian would be sitting right here, breathing in the dust of his choices, trying to decide if his words were a confession or a provocation. She opened the first diary again, flipping past the initial entries. She stopped at one marked with a thin fold in the corner. March 17, 1953. Northern delegates have stormed out of the Lagos Conference again. Their protest is, at its heart, fear. They worry that the South will drown them in a tide of books and ballots. Whitehall, of course, sees opportunity in fear. A frightened region is a loyal region. I have advised the resident to ensure education in the North expands only as quickly as its emirs permit. Rapid enlightenment is too dangerous. It breeds questions and the South already questions too much. Adaeze frowned. She had read similar theories in academic papers, but she'd never seen it stated so bluntly, so coldly. This was a confession, laid bare. She read on. March 28th. A curious proposal arose at dinner tonight to increase Northern representation at the federal level in anticipation of self-rule. To maintain national cohesion, they say, in truth, it is to prevent Southern intellectual dominance. I find myself torn. We preach unity, yet engineer imbalance. We claim we are midwives to independence, yet fear the child we are meant to deliver. Adaeze let out a long, slow breath. This wasn't the voice of some mindless colonial drone. This was the voice of a man juggling ambition, fear, and a twisted sense of responsibility. A man who truly believed he was shaping destiny. She turned the page, her fingers tracing the brittle paper. And then she froze. Inside, nestled among neatly tied bundles of letters, were stacks of leather-bound journals. Adaeze lifted the topmost one. The leather was supple, the title embossed in gold, Zungru, 1912. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was a precise, elegant script. January 1st, 1912, it began. Another year begins in this land of ceaseless sun. Lugard speaks of amalgamation as an inevitability, a matter of administrative convenience. He sees a map, a territory to be managed. He does not see the people, or perhaps he sees them too clearly. They are not one, to bind the North with its ancient emirates and its proud horsemen. To the South, with its traders and its fractious intellectuals, it is not nation-building. It is the crafting of a cage. I have advised against it. I have warned that this union, forged in London for London's benefit, will one day tear itself apart. My counsel is noted, and then ignored. Audie's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just a historical record. It was a confession. She spent the entire day, and then the night, poring over the journals. Marlowe's entries were a secret history of Nigeria. He detailed conversations in smoke-filled London clubs where Nigeria's future was decided over port and cigars. He wrote of deliberate actions taken to ensure the northern region would have dominance in any future federation. A strategy to maintain British influence through a compliant ruling class, he called it the long game. There were entries about the census of 1952, with notes in the margins describing how figures were manipulated. To grant the North a permanent majority is to grant ourselves a permanent lever, Marlowe wrote. He described meetings with young, ambitious Nigerian politicians from all regions, sizing them up, noting their weaknesses, their vanities, their price. It was a masterclass in colonial manipulation, all laid bare. He hadn't just been an observer. He had been an architect. A week turned into 2. Adaeze barely ate or slept. Her office became a fortress of paper and revelations. She found a detailed account of the days leading up to the 1966 coup. Marlowe, by then retired but still a consultant to the Foreign Office, had received intelligence about the impending military action. But he hadn't shared it with the Nigerian federal government. He wrote, "A short, sharp shock may be necessary. The politicians have become too independent. The military, at least, understands hierarchy. They will be more receptive to advice." He had let it happen. He had watched the country he helped create burn, believing it was for the best. The final journal was dated 1970, just after the end of the Biafran War. Marlowe was an old man by then, living in a quiet English village. His last entry was filled with a chilling, almost detached sense of reflection. They have paid the price for the union we designed. 1 million souls, perhaps more. A tragedy, of course. But the Federation holds, the oil flows. British interests are secure. History will call it a Nigerian failure. But we, who were in the room where the first lines were drawn, know the truth. It was not a failure of their making. It was the intended consequence of our design. Adaeze closed the final journal, her hands trembling. The dust motes still danced in the light, but they no longer seemed innocent. They felt like the ashes of a history that had been deliberately buried. She had the proof. The whispers were true. The chaos hadn't been an accident. It had been a plan. She looked out the window at the bustling, vibrant, chaotic city of Lagos. She now understood that she was standing not just in an archive, but at the scene of a crime that stretched back a century. And the sea chest wasn't a gift. It was a burden, the burden of truth. Now, what was she going to do with it? Publishing this would rewrite the history of her nation, but it would also ignite a firestorm. It would force a reckoning that the country, even now, might not be ready for. The question was no longer what had happened, but what would happen next. now that the Shadow Man's secrets were finally in the light. Tucked between the pages of the diary was a photograph. It was black and white, its edges still crisp, its corners sharp. It showed a man named Marlowe standing beside a group of men in flowing northern robes, unmistakably. Behind them, a British officer looked on with the smugness of someone who believed he was indispensable. On the back, in ink that had nearly faded to ghosts, were 3 words: "Before the pact." "What pact?" Adaeze whispered to herself. She quickly flipped back to the diary, her eyes scanning the page for an answer. And there it was. An entry dated April 2nd, 1953. It read, "The pact is delicate, unwritten, unspoken, but understood. The northern aristocracy shall maintain its authority. Britain shall support them in exchange for loyalty as independence approaches. This will ensure the new nation does not fall into radical southern hands. Some say it is unfair. Perhaps it is, but empire is not built on fairness. It is built on calculation." Adaeze sat very still, the words hanging in the air. This was it, the seed of a nation shaped not by an equal partnership, but by a strategic, deliberate imbalance. As anger began to simmer within her, she noticed something else in Marlowe's writing, a flicker of doubt. The faint outline of a man who understood the heavy consequences of his actions, even if he would never admit them out loud. Just then, a soft knock at the door made her jump. "Come in," she said, quickly closing the diary. Her research assistant, Colonial, stepped inside. He was young, eager, and chronically late, perpetually smelling of bus diesel and roasted groundnuts. "Madame Nipa has taken light," he said apologetically. "The generator is," he paused, his eyes falling on the open chest on the floor. "What is that?" Adaeze hesitated. For a split second, she considered telling him everything, showing him the diary, the photograph, the pact. But Marlowe's earlier words echoed in her mind. "Saltpeter stable until heat is applied." She decided to keep it to herself, for now. "Just some old colonial records," she said lightly, trying to sound dismissive. "Nothing exciting." Colonial raised an eyebrow, a hint of suspicion in his gaze. "If you say so." He turned and left, and Adaeze quickly locked the door behind him. When she returned to the chest, her eyes caught something she had overlooked before. It was a second envelope, larger than the first, sealed with the red wax of the Colonial office. It was stamped with 2 words, "Eyes only, -1,959. With a sudden jolt of apprehension, she realized this envelope had been hidden. It was tucked away beneath a false wooden panel at the very bottom of the chest. Someone had gone to great lengths to conceal this. Her pulse quickened. With trembling hands, she broke the wax seal and lifted the flap. Inside were copies of telegrams. They were communications between the British High Commission, the Colonial Office, and select Nigerian officials in the final, crucial months before independence. Her eyes flew across the first one, ensure Northern Bloc assured of post-independence majority representation. Southern agitation must be moderated to avoid risk of destabilization. She grabbed another. Recommend limited intelligence sharing with Northern leadership to maintain influence after withdrawal. And another. Her hand started to shake. Potential volatility among Southern officers in military ranks suggest monitoring. Possible need for intervention if unrest escalates. Addie's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just simple manipulation. This was foresight. It was as if they were anticipating the exact tensions that would explode in the mid-1960s. The coups, the counter-coup, the country's horrifying descent into blood and war. She looked at the final telegram in the stack. It was stamped most urgent and dated July 1959. Calculated instruction. If internal conflict arises, support factions aligned with British economic and political interests. Maintain advisory presence where feasible. Adaeze dropped the papers as if they had burned her. The room started to spin. Suddenly, everything made a terrible kind of sense. Marlowe's cryptic words in the letter, the diaries, the pact, even the dagger lying at the bottom of the chest like a final sharp punctuation mark. This chest wasn't just an archive of historical documents, it was an indictment. It was a map, carefully drawn, of the fault lines that were engineered into the very foundation of the country. Long before it ever had a chance to know itself, she sank into her chair, the enormous weight of her discovery pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. Outside, the familiar groan of generators rumbled to life as the city's electricity faltered once again. The lights in her room flickered, then returned reluctantly, wavering and uncertain. Staring at the silent chest, Adaeze whispered to the empty room, "What have I found?" The chest sat before her, patient as ever, its secrets finally unbound, and it seemed to answer her in the silence, only the beginning. What Adaeze found was more than just history, it was a blueprint for a nation's turmoil. These weren't just dusty papers, they were the architects of a future conflict. The British didn't just leave, they left behind a carefully constructed system designed to protect their interests, no matter the cost to the new nation. They identified the divisions, the potential leaders, the levers of power, and they set the stage. The telegrams show a clear strategy: empower one group, moderate another, and prepare to intervene if things didn't go their way. Think about the implications. The ethnic and regional tensions that led to the Nigerian Civil War were not just spontaneous, they were foreseen and arguably encouraged. The volatility among Southern officers mentioned in the telegrams was a direct precursor to the first military coup in 1966. By selectively sharing intelligence and promising support, the British government was essentially choosing sides before the game had even begun. They created a power imbalance that was destined to collapse. This story isn't just about Nigeria, it's a pattern repeated across the globe during the age of decolonization. Colonial powers rarely just packed up and went home. They often engaged in what is known as neocolonialism, a way of maintaining economic and political control without direct rule. They would install friendly leaders, manipulate political structures, and sign economic deals that favored them, ensuring they could continue to extract resources and influence long after their flags were lowered. The documents Adaeze found are the smoking gun. They prove that the struggles faced by many newly independent nations were not solely due to internal failures. They were often the result of a deliberate, calculated strategy by their former rulers. The pact was a promise of power to one group, which inevitably meant disenfranchising another. This created a legacy of resentment and instability that has haunted the country for decades. The chest, in essence, contained the original sin of the nation's post-colonial existence. It explains why the motto, unity and faith, peace and progress, has often felt more like a hopeful prayer than a reality. The very foundations were cracked from the start. So, when Adaeze asks, "What have I found?" the answer is chilling. She's found the reason why. She's found the evidence of a deep and lasting betrayal. The story from here is about what she does with this knowledge. Does she expose it and risk reopening old wounds, or does she keep it secret, allowing the carefully constructed official history to remain unchallenged? Her journey is just beginning, and the fate of this explosive truth now rests in her hands. Thanks so much for watching. If this story captivated you, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. See you in the next video.